read along for Chapter 4 of the Mice and Men. Please make sure that you're following along in your book or completing your reading guide as we go. Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square, four-paned window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crooks's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window there were pegs, on which hung broken harnesses in the process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself was a little bench for leather-working tools, curved knives and needles and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with the horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, the trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking out over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions, for, being alone, Crooks could leave his thing about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was much more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. He had his books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code from 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large, gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head. Because of their depth, they seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, teeth champing on hay, the rattle of the halter chains. In the stable-buck's room, a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans in the back, and in one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of liniment into his pink-palmed hand, and reached up under his shirt to rub again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. Noiselessly, Lenny appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders filling the opening. For a moment Crooks did not see him, but on raising his eyes he stiffened and a scowl came on his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lenny smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lenny gulped, and his smile grew more fawning. "I ain't doing nothing," he said. "I just come to look at my puppy. I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on and get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play 'cause I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, y'all stink of me." Lenny flapped his big hands helplessly. "Everybody went into town," he said. "Sim and George and everybody. George said I gotta stay here and not get in no trouble. I seen your light." "Well, what you want?" "Nothing. I seen your light. I figured I'd just come in and sit." Crooks stared at Lenny, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared at him. "I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway," he complained. "You ain't no Skinner. There's no call for a bucket to come into the barn at all. You ain't no Skinner. You got nothing to do with the horses." "The pup," Lenny repeated. I come to see my pup." "Well, go see your pup then. Don't come into a place where you're not wanted." Lenny lost his smile. He advanced a step into the room, then remembered and back to the door again. "Well, I worked at him a little. Slim says I ain't to pet him very much." Crooks said, "Well, you've been taking him out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move him someplace else." "Oh, she don't care. She lets me." Lenny had moved into the room again. Crooks scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. "Well, come in and sit a while," Crooks said. "As long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well go sit down." His tone was a little more friendly. All the boys going into town, huh? Y'all but old Candy. He sits in the bunkhouse sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. Crooks adjusted his glasses. Figuring? What's a Candy figuring about? Lenny almost shouted, "But the rabbits!" "Oh, you're nuts," said Crooks. "You crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about?" "The rabbits we're gonna get, and I get to tend them and cut grass and give them water and like that." "Just nuts," said Crooks. "I don't blame the guys you travel with keeping you out of sight." Lenny said quietly, "It ain't no lie. We're gonna do it. We're gonna get a little place and live on the fat of the land." Crooks settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. "Sit down," he invited. "Sit down over there on the nail keg." Lenny hunched down on the little barrel. "You think it's a lie," Lenny said, "but it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth. You can ask George." Crooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. "You travel around with George, don't you?" "Sure, me and him go every place together." Crooks continued. "Sometimes he talks and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Ain't that so?" He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. "Ain't that so?" "Yeah, sometimes. He just talks on and you don't know what the hell it's all about?" "Yeah, sometimes, but not always." Crooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. "I ain't a Southern Negro," he said. "I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. When white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went out to play with them, and some of them was pretty nice. My old man didn't like that. And I never knew till long later why he didn't like that, but I know now." He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "There isn't another colored family for miles around. And now there ain't a colored man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad." He laughed. "If I say something, it's just a black kid saying it." Lenny asked, "Well, how long do you think it'll be before them pups are old enough to pet?" Crooks laughed again. "A guy can talk to you, and he can be sure you won't go blabbing. Couple of weeks, and them pups will be all right. George knows what he's about. Just talks, and you don't understand nothing." He leaned forward excitedly. "This is just a black man talking, and a busted black man, so it don't mean nothing, see? You wouldn't remember anyways. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference. If you don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking. Or they're sitting and still not talking. It don't make no difference, no difference." His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. "George can tell you screw things, and it don't matter. It's just the talking. It's just being with some guy, that's all." He paused. His voice grew soft and persuasive. "Suppose George don't come back no more. Suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What you do then?" Lenny's attention came gradually to what had been said. "What?" he demanded. "I said, suppose George went into town tonight, and you never heard of him no more." Crooks pressed forward with some kind of private victory. "Just suppose that," he repeated. He won't do it," Lenny cried. "George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight." But doubt was too much for him. "Don't you think he will?" Crooks's face lighted with pleasure in his torture. "Nobody can tell what a guy do," he observed calmly. "Let's say he wants to come back and can't. Suppose he get killed or hurt or something so he can't come back." Lenny struggled to understand. "George wouldn't do nothing like that," he repeated. "George is careful. He's won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt because he's careful." "Well, just suppose he don't come back. What do you do then?" Lenny's face wrinkled in apprehension. "I don't know. Say, what are you doing anyway?" he cried. "This ain't true. George ain't got hurt." Crooks bored in on him. "You want me to tell you what happens? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog." Suddenly Lenny's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously towards Crooks. "Who hurt George?" he demanded. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. "I was just supposing," he said. "George ain't hurt. He's all right. He'll be back all right." Lenny stood over him. "What's you supposing for? Ain't nobody going to suppose no hurt to George." Crooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. "Just sit down," he said. "George ain't hurt." Lenny growled back to his seat on the nail keg. "Ain't nobody going to talk no hurt to George," he grumbled. Crooks said gently, Maybe you could see now. You got George, and you know he come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go back in the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you gotta read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him. He whined. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, as long as he's with you. I tell you, he cried. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely, and he gets sick. George gonna come back, Lenny reassured himself in a frightened voice. Maybe George come back already. Maybe I gotta go see. Crooks said, I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. A guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. Sometimes he gets thinking and he got no one to tell him what's so and ain't so. Maybe he sees something. He don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, he could tell me I was asleep and then it would be all right, but I just don't know. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. Lenny said miserably, George won't go away and leave me. I know George, he wouldn't do that. The stable buck went on dreamily. I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. Had 2 brothers. They was always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed, all 3. Had a strawberry patch, had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a Sunday morning. My brothers would sit on the fence rail and watch 'em. White chickens they was. Gradually, Lenny's interest came around to what was being said. George said we're going to have alfalfa for rabbits. What rabbits? We're going to have rabbits and a berry patch. You're nuts. We are too. You ask George. You're nuts, Crooks said scornfully. I seen hundreds of men come on by the road and on the ranches. They had bindles on their back and the same damn thing to their heads. Hundreds of them. They come and they quit and they go on, and every damn one of them's got a little piece of land in his head. And never a goddamn one of them gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody never gets no land. It's just in their head. They all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head. He paused and looked towards the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. A horse whinnied. I guess somebody's out there, said Crooks. Maybe Slim? Slim comes in here 2-3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team. He pulled himself painfully upright and moved towards the door. Is that you, Slim? He called. Candy's voice answered. Slim went into town. Say, have you seen Lenny? You mean the big guy? Yeah, you seen him around any place? He's in here, Crooks said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway, scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. I tell you what, Lenny, I've been figuring about them rabbits. Crooks said irritably, You come in if you want. Candy seemed embarrassed. Well, I don't know. Of course, if you want me to. Just come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. Well, you got a nice cozy little place here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all by yourself this way. Yeah, sure, said Crooks, and a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Lenny broke in. You say about the rabbits. Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched his wrist stump. Well, I've been here a long time, he said, and Crooks been here a long time, but this is the first time I ever been in his room. Crooks said darkly, Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody here but Slim, and Slim's the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a skinner as I ever seen. Lenny leaned towards the old swamper. But the rabbits, he insisted. Candy smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. Well, I get to attend to them, Lenny broke in. George says I get to attend. He promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys is kidding yourself. You talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Hell, I've seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be in the road 2-3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You goddamn right we're gonna do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George now? In town, in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land to their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried. Well, sure they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land, not much. Just something that was his. Something he could live on, and there couldn't nobody throw him off it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in the state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvested, I wasn't none of my harvest. But we gonna do it now, and we not gonna make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. Money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George, we gotta have a room to ourselves. We're gonna have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're gonna have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crooks asked, You say you got the money? Damn right, we got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land all picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. I never seen a guy really do it, he said. I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes. He hesitated. If you guys want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, well, I could come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch if I want to. Any of you boys seen Curly? They swung their heads towards the door. Looking in was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up, and her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly, as though she had been running. Well, Curly ain't been here, Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, and her eyes traveled from one face to the other. They left all the weak ones here, she said finally. You don't think I know where they all went? Even Curly, I know where they all went. Lenny watched her, fascinated, but Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, Well, if you know, then why you ask us where Curly at? She regarded them amusedly. Funny thing, she said. If I catch any one man when he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad. She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you is scared the rest is going to do something on the other one. After a pause, Crooks said, Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble. Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. You think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? You think I like to stick in that house all the time? Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, You got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys causing trouble. The girl flared up. Yeah, sure I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's gonna do to guys he don't like, and he don't like nobody. You think I'm gonna stay in that 2x4 house and listen to how Curly's gonna lead with his last twins, and then bring in the old right cross? 1-2, he says. Just the old 1-2, and he'll go down. She paused, and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. Say, what happened to Curly's hand? There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny, then he coughed. What? Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am. Bust his hand. She watched for a moment, then she laughed. Baloney! What do you think you're selling me? Curly started something he didn't finish. Caught in a machine. Baloney! Why, he didn't give nobody the good old 1-2 since he got his hand bust. Who bust him? Candy repeated sullenly. Got it caught in a machine. All right, she said contemptuously. All right, cover him up if you want. What do I care? You bindle bums think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went with the shows. Not just one, neither. And a guy told me he could put me in the pictures. She was breathless with indignation. Saturday night. Everybody out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. A black guy and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. And liking it, because there ain't nobody else. Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backwards. I had enough, he said angrily. You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. Suppose you get us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy two-bit job like this? You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land and it's ours, and we can go to it. Curly's wife laughed at him. Baloney, she said. I've seen too many of you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, you'd be getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys. Candy's face had grown redder and redder. Before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of this situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you just better scatter along now, 'cause Curly ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lenny until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, Where'd you get them bruises on your face? Lenny looked up guiltily. Who, me? Yeah, you. Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. He got his hand caught in a machine, he said. Curly's wife laughed. Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines. Candy broke in. You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says, and George won't have you messing with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? Lenny smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, maybe I'll get a couple of rabbits myself. Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. You just get out, and get out quick, and if you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in scorn. Listen, she said. You know what I could do to you if you open your trap? Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. You know what I could do? Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Well, then you keep your place. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Crooks reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, Yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so she could whip at him again, but Crooks sat perfectly still, eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other 2. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. If you was to do that, we'd tell, he said quietly. We'd tell about you framing Crooks. Tell and be damned, she'd cried. Nobody'd listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you. Candy subsided. No, he agreed. Nobody'd listen to us. Lenny whined. I wish George was here. I wish George was here. Candy stepped over to him. Don't you worry none, he said. I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet. He turned to Curly's wife. You better go home now, he said quietly. If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here. She appraised him coolly. I ain't sure you heard nothing. Better not take no chances, he said. If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way. She turned to Lenny. I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself. She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted, and some stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. Was that the truth you said? About the guys coming back? He asked. Sure, I heard him. I didn't hear nothing. The gate banged, Candy said, and he went on. Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. Guess she'd had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man gotta have some rights, even if you don't like 'em. Candy said, That bitch ought not have said that to you. That wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys coming in and setting made me forget. What she says is true. The horses snorted out in the barn, and the chains rang, and a voice called, "Lenny! Hey, Lenny, you in the barn?" "It's George!" Lenny cried, and he answered, "Here, George, I'm right here." In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. "What are you doing in Crooks's room? You had not to be in here." Crooks nodded. "I told them, but they come in anyway." "Well, why didn't you kick him out?" "I didn't care much," said Crooks. "Lenny's a nice fella." Now Candy aroused himself. "Oh, George, I've been figuring, and I got it all doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits." George scowled. "Thought I told you not to tell nobody about that." Candy was crestfallen. "I didn't tell nobody but Crooks." George said, "Well, you guys get out of here. Geez, seems like I can't go away for a minute." Candy and Lenny stood up and went towards the door. Crooks called, "Candy." "Ah? You remember what I said about hoeing and doing our jobs?" "Yeah," said Candy, "I remember." "Well, just forget it," said Crooks. "I didn't mean it. I just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that." "Okay, if you feel like that. Good night." The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment. Then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and back and poured a little liniment into his pink palm, and, reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back.